it's important that the calf was golden. Remembering that the Bible does actually say this eye of the needle thing. And then people can be like, well, then why have Christian interpretations, for example, we'll take Christians spread, that do not admonish personal indulgence as much? Right. And it's like, well, suppose you have multiple interpretations of the Bible competing. The interpretations that don't admonish those things are going to be disproportionately picked up by wealthy individuals. They're going to get more money from those individuals, and they're going to be able to use that to spread their message more, to buy ads, to reach out to people. When you tell people what they want to hear, you can get this sort of lowest common denominator to buy into you. And this is a problem for a lot of people, where a lot of people have this thought where, yeah, but it feels good when I use these systems. When I use earthly grandeur as an intermediary for God, that feels good. A lot of paths to the deceiver feel good. In fact, most do. When Satan came to test Jesus, he didn't say, hey, if you go away from God, I'll hit you with a spiked bat.
Would you like to know more?
Hello, Simone. It is wonderful to be here with you today. Today, we're doing another one of these Tract videos where we talk about religious things, or like our family's religion. And we always do them on Fridays, right before the weekend. So if you don't like these, by the way, because I know they're thematically a little different than some of our other videos, the thumbnails are quite thematically different. Both of us will be on opposite sides, and there'll be like a full image. Not every thumbnail can perfectly fits this framework, but we try to fit it when we can. So you can just avoid them. But this one is on the topic of idolatry, which I accidentally called iconoclasm. I got it mixed up with its antonym in the last tract, but fixing it this time, idolatry. And idolatry has been a very interesting topic for me to explore, because it's one of those things that just gets reaffirmed within every one of the monotheistic traditions, as we sort of describe the monotheistic traditions in the three faith systems. And I didn't understand why. Whether you're talking from a theological perspective or a secular perspective. If it's a secular perspective, why does idolatry keep showing up in unrelated monotheistic systems, or monotheistic systems that are separated from each other, as this cardinal sin? And then I have the question from a religious perspective, right? In the same way that when I heard the normal interpretation of the Adam and Eve story, right? The one that you might come to if you hadn't actually read it, is that God didn't want man to have knowledge of what's good and what's bad. And that is clearly not what I think the story is saying. But I had heard that, and I was like, that can't be what it actually says. It clearly says something other than that. And I went back to it and I was like, okay. But with idolatry, it was the same thing. It was God's clearly not jealous of pictures or something, right? That's the way a lot of people talk about it. What? An ineffable, all-powerful being is afraid of a picture, or jealous or spiteful around that? There must be some reason around this that's for our benefit. But I'd love to hear your thoughts before we dive into this on the topic, before I bias you too much on idolatry.
Yeah, the hunch I have coming into this is as follows. Religion was evolved by humans to be able to exist in complex civilizations, larger than family clans or small tribe formats. And as such, it's all about enabling us to act against our instincts in a way that is adaptive for these more complex spaces. It is the software that runs on top of our hardware, enabling us to live in complex worlds that we cannot biologically adapt to fast enough through genetic selection. So the reason why I think it's very important to ditch idolatry, or why it's being fought against, is or maybe at least there's a correlation, is that it's so instinctive for people to fall to that. You see this in fan universes. You see this with Snape wives. You see this with it is our default. It's so easy. It feels good. It is a very instinctual behavior. And religion is all about enabling people to rise above, to go above their instincts. And so that's what I'm thinking. Although you talk about it's so weird that God wouldn't be jealous. I mean, wives can't stand the fact that their husbands watch erotic material. So
I think you're right here to an extent, but I'd also keep in mind that it is really only a key trait within the monotheistic traditions. Within mystical and polytheistic traditions, even when those traditions are practiced under an Abrahamic faith structure, they typically don't mind idolatry that much, which is really interesting. So Tract 4, idolatry is worse than murder. God has revealed a succession of major prophets, and every single time, whether it was Zohar, Moses, Jesus, or Muhammad, each one of them has reaffirmed just how much God hates idolatry and how seriously he takes it. With every iterative prophet, God does not just reiterate this commandment, but also further emphasizes it. It is almost as if God keeps reminding us we drift from his message, and so he must remind us again, but louder and more explicitly. Yet humanity's desire to tokenize God is so overwhelming, even our learned, religiously minded individuals find themselves attempting to normalize it. Consider the Second Council of Nicene, the last time the Orthodox Christians and the Catholics ever agreed on anything. God does not warn us to not do the things of which we have no inclination to do. He warns us against the things that we will find tempting. Images of Jesus were popular amongst the laity, and many argued having images of Jesus was just affirming your love for him. If God did not want us doing that, he would have explicitly told us something like, quote, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image," end quote. This is, of course, a joke. God did gift man explicitly those words, so there wasn't the slightest room for misinterpretation, and put this commandment literally right under the first commandment, so there's no misunderstanding that he might have meant just don't worship images/idols, as that would have been covered in the first commandment. To God, this commandment came even above the commandment to not murder or steal. Yet the desire to create those images is so strong in man, almost every Abrahamic faction has fallen to it to some extent or another. I don't point this out to rag on Orthodox and Catholic Christians, but to point out how quickly even pious men break from God's rules around idolatry. Of all of God's commandments, it is the commandment pious individuals find the hardest to keep, and that is why it is emphasized among all of God's prophets. And I really mean this. You find this within every single one of the monotheistic traditions. The most faithful people, it is a commandment that they are most likely to break. And I think it's the reason why God emphasizes it so much, putting it above murder. Like murder, most people at least instinctually realize is wrong. Like idolatry is something that I think a lot of people, they think, well, if I'm worshiping God through these things, therefore it's not wrong, even if God told me it was wrong. And
I think it's also those who are more devout are more likely to get caught up in it, because if you're not very devout, you're not trying to find shortcuts to get closer to God. You're not trying to see God in everything, right? So you're way less likely to be subject to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is, I think, why he emphasizes the point so much. And I would note here, a lot of people are like, well, why create a quote unquote new like denomination for your family or something like that? Why not just go to one of the traditional ones? And in creating a new denomination, we are able to look at questions like idolatry, right? And use the text to guide our answers to those questions without accidentally affirming a quote unquote religion's answer. So, for example, I might go to some religious individuals and they'll be like, look, I understand the text says it, but our religion says it's okay, right? Like the holy men in our religion say it's okay. We've been doing this for centuries at this point. It is something that is affirmed within our religion, even if it is prohibited in the text. And this is something that you'll see like throughout the tracks that we're doing here. And it's just a big part of what we're doing with this is going through text or major like prohibitions and stuff like that and reaffirming them. Like prohibitions against polytheism was really one of the, and mysticism was what we were focused on in the last one, that have seeped their way into many Abrahamic traditions. And now it's idolatry. We need to be stricter on these things because it was supposed to be something that we would treat very seriously. Did you have any other thoughts before I go further?
No, I agree with you though. Go on.
Well, so now to the point. Why is idolatry so uniquely offensive to God? Why do humans struggle so much with this clear and repeated commandment from God? God delivers his revelation through a succession of prophets because man's capacity for understanding him increases over time. Bronze Age pastoralists did not have the capacity to spread the message of anything other than an anthropomorphic God combined with mystical hoodoo. However, we are not Bronze Age pastoralists, and as such, God expects us to reinterpret his revelations with pragmatic logic. God is not the type of entity capable of offense or jealousy. If he has given us a commandment, he has given it to us for our own benefit, and only for our own benefit. He warns us against idolatry because it is in our own best interest. Wait, how? People make images of God because it allows us to feel closer to him, or at least a representation of him. Why does God warn us against this? Because that image is not him. A picture of Jesus is as far from God as a picture of a red-hooven being with a goatee, and praying to each is equally harmful to the human soul. Whatever entity is represented in that image is not God, and as your heart moves closer to it, it moves further from God. All representations of God made by man that are assigned theological significance move man further from God. And so just to like talk like not in the text here, what really brought me to this is I reapproached it and I said, what if I am approaching this not saying like, okay, God's like petty or jealous or something like that, but I approach the prohibition on idolatry with the assumption that it was for our own best interest. In the
Yeah.
same way, something like a prohibition on murder is in the best interest of society. All of the other prohibitions have a clear utility to a monotheistic culture. So why would they be giving us this? Like, why is God giving us this? Why would he be giving us this? Like, why is God giving us this? Because he wants it to be in our best interest. Well, if you assume that, then just ask, okay, how would this be in our best interest from a theological perspective? Well, it would mean that that image is in no way a representation to God. In no way does it get you closer to God.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you worship through it, with it as an intermediary, you are worshiping something other than God. And somebody could be like, no, I'm worshiping the entity that it represents. And what I am saying is the entity represented, even by a picture of Jesus, is not God. It is what we would call the basilisk or deceiver, the deceit, misinformation, because it in no way captures any of God's real characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're going to take your secular framework here to like expand on this interpretation of it, I think that's really interesting as well. So why from a secular perspective would this group so well with the monotheistic traditions? Well, the monotheistic traditions typically lump logic over emotion. That's an important thing throughout them, rules over sort of like trying to get to God through other means. Well, within the mystical traditions, what you're typically doing is you're trying to reach God through like God exists in me, he exists in you, he exists in nature, and so you can attempt to reach God through worshiping those things. Well, because the monotheistic traditions directly contrast with that, God exists only in logic and in study, and in human industry. Well, you need to sort of create this barrier between the mystical world and say, do not accidentally fall to that, because it leads to non-productive societies. And I think we really, see this in the history of, the Abrahamic framework. After Al-Ghazali, promoted Sufism within Islam, it was very shortly after that we saw the collapse of the Islamic technological revolution and elevated mysticism. And what was interesting is he was doing that to fight growing polytheism. There was like a polytheist movement within Islam that he was attempting to fight, where they were saying, well, God is like the sun and stuff like that. And his logic was very ordered, right? If you read his stuff, he's actually a pretty good philosopher. But because he elevated the mystical traditions, which should have been banned by, he doomed the entire tradition. And so I think that's why you're seeing it there, because it leads to the focus on these mystical traditions or are these polytheistic traditions, both of which remove industry from the group and cause sort of mindless speculation and the elevation of some individuals who claim to have, and we'll go into like how groups without really strict bans against idolatry can fall into cycles that lead them to be incredibly inefficient. Okay. But do you have any other thoughts on this?
No, I didn't know that about the origins of Sufism. That's interesting.
No, he didn't create Sufism, by the way. He was a famous scholar who then became a Sufi and then elevated Sufism because he was a real huge adherent of it. For people who don't know Sufism, it's basically Islamic Kabbalism, but even more extreme in terms of its mystical framings. This truth reveals two things. First, it is not the act of someone drawing God or one of his intermediaries that is being warned against. It is assigning theological significance to that drawing in an effort to get closer to God. The sin was that people believed these physical items made by man or in nature were a conduit through which they could interact with God. For this reason, when a Muslim extremist smashes a statue of a Buddha that no one has worshipped in a century, they commit an act of sin by destroying a piece of cultural heritage that could inform us about the nature of man. At the same time, if that same Muslim writes a line from the Quran as a piece of art or bans the burning of a Quran as a physical object of theological significance, they are committing the highest form of idolatry. When a Muslim adorns a mosque with gold, believing that in some way earthly metal has the capacity to quote unquote improve the mosque, they are acting in direct rebellion to God's will. Every geometric pattern, every ounce of gold leaf, every physical book that was treated as sacred, instead of the words and concepts within it, shackles the soul of the idolater and drags it towards the deceiver. So I think, here, when you hate, and you see this with Muslims, and I'm specifically picking on Muslims here because they're often seen as being the strictest of the Abrahamic faith about idolatry.
Exactly.
And yet, in many ways, they're also the worst idolaters of all the Abrahamic faiths, because they ascribe literal religious significance to the physical object of the Quran. And I understand why they did it. Like, if you're just approaching these rules without any thought as to how these rules got there or why God would say this to you, you're like, okay, well, then it must be safe to use, geometric patterns on mosques and fill them with gold leaf and fill them with words from the Quran and use that as art, because it was like he was jealous of pictures of Muhammad or something like that, or he found them distasteful, which to me, that doesn't make any sense. Like, what does God want us going around and destroying 1,000-year-old statues of Buddha? Like, that doesn't seem like something that God would want us to not accidentally attempt to worship him through something that has no relation to him and that is a pass to something other than him. Yeah, that seems perfectly rational to me.
Yeah.
But do you have any other thoughts here?
No, I agree. And I appreciate your pointing out, because I think the key points that you make about idolatry in general are that some of the worst offenders are those who are like, yeah, it's terrible, which is interesting because I think it just loops back to this theme of just how tempting it is for the especially devout to fall into this trap, and how much correction it requires, because it is just so hard to resist the temptation of idolatry if you are devout.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that you can really see this in Muslims. Ironically, if a cartoonist draws a picture of Muhammad, that is not idolatry, because the cartoonist puts no religious significance into that picture.
Yeah, he doesn't feel like it's getting him closer to God in any way, shape, or form.
And it has no religious significance.
Yeah, it's not going to bring anyone else closer to God or make people think it's going to bring them closer to God.
But it's not just about getting close to God. The moment a Muslim looks at that picture and ascribes religious significance to that picture, the moment a Muslim says, you cartoonist, you drew a picture and now this picture has some sort of negative theological weight, they have actually committed the act of idolatry, because they imbued an image, a physical thing, with religious significance. That is the act of idolatry. Isn't the cartoonist drawing Muhammad? It is the Muslim deciding that drawing has spiritual value, even if it is a negative spiritual value.
Well, I guess, yeah, because you are assuming that it's harmful and therefore powerful, right?
Exactly, right? So idolatry works in the negative too. If you think that a site is cursed or something like that, that's a form of idolatry, because you are ascribing spiritual power to things in the physical world.
I had not thought of it that way. Interesting.
Once we understand why God warns us so frequently and explicitly about idolatry, we learn there is a much deeper meaning to be examined here outside of quote unquote smashed statues. Man, as he exists today, is incapable of conceiving of God. When man attempts to conceive of God, what he holds within his mind is a repugnant rat king when contrasted with God's glory. The images of God that humans create, not just the ones in the physical world, but also the ones in our mind, move us further from God. To attempt to grasp God's majesty with our fallen minds is a crime in God's eyes worse than murder, because it is more harmful to our souls. This becomes uniquely so. Sorry, I'm just going to take a quick aside here, which is this is where idolatry becomes specifically, and we're going to talk about this in the next track, about mystical framings of God. these shortcuts that some individuals attempt to take to interact with God,
Mhm.
and seeing God in the natural world. This becomes uniquely important to individuals that think they have the ability to, quote unquote, talk to God, that they have a personal relationship with God. The thing they are talking to is not God. It is themselves, their
Mm.
personal wish for what God was like. But it is not what God is like, and therefore leads them further from God's glory. Man, as he exists now, cannot have a relationship with God. As Winwood Reade writes, we teach that there is a God, but not a God of the anthropic variety, not a God who is gratified by compliments in prose and verse, and whose attributes can be cataloged by theologians. God is so great that he cannot be defined by us. God is so great that he does not deign to have personal relations with us as human atoms that are called men. Those who desire to worship the Creator must worship him through mankind. Just, I actually put the tracks out of order. So the track where we explain the significance to our iteration of the faith of Winwood Reade in his teachings. This isn't teachings that, for example, individuals who are coming at this from a Christian or Jewish or Muslim variety, but if you're coming at this faith system from a secular variety, his teachings can be quite useful. And from my perspective, they're quite useful. And that's why I'm bringing them up here. But I also think that's true. When you try to interact directly with God, it pulls you away from your fellow man and from the philosophy of your fellow man, from the technology and from the labor of your fellow man, and from this sort of community effort of uplifting all of mankind, through industry, through austerity, and through philosophy, which is something that you can forget about. And we see this in the idolatry of the asceticism, for example, when an individual like leaves society and go lives alone is like a hermit or something like that, right? Like that's a form of idolatry, and that they are attempting to get closer to God in a way that forsakes their fellow man,
Right.
and ultimately is self-indulgent. And we see this from Murashid al-Ghazali. He converted to Sufism after one of these episodes, right? Like this happens. You have one of these self-indulgent episodes, and then you fall to one of the mystic traditions. This is why when we tell our children to pray to supernatural agents, we tell them to pray to their distant descendants. This is not them talking to an imaginary entity or modeling an entity whose structure and consciousness they could not possibly predict, but instead a real being that will one day exist, and therefore not a form of idolatry. Through modeling a genetically and synthetically augmented but still human mind, one with an iteratively clearer understanding of the true nature of God, they are able to get closer to what God wants from them without risking blasphemy. Moreover, it is self-evident within our religious framework that God wants us to do our best to increase the potentiality of future humans, and thus us modeling what they would want from us and what they would reward us for doing helps us model what God would want to say to us without committing idolatry. Do we really think children are able to communicate with distant descendants? No. However, we do believe that this framing for the emulated mental model created within our kids' brains that they are communicating with creates responses closer to God's will than attempting to directly model the will of God within the human mind. When
Hmm.
humans attempt to model God, they create the way they wish he existed rather than how he actually does, which leads to sinful indulgence. This reminds me of a woman that both you and I know who told us she always listened to her husband, except when God told her otherwise. How very convenient that God had a penchant for her preferred indulgences. And this is always a problem I see when people say, oh, I talk to God, because then that thing that they're talking to, the way they wishes God was, can affirm indulgences, idolatry itself, for example, that they shouldn't have affirmed to them, and this is one area where I think a lot of people are like, your belief system is very similar to Mormonism, where it's actually quite different from Mormonism. And that within Mormonism is, well, just go personally pray on it and God will tell you the right answer, where I don't think that that's how God communicates with people. Well, and the reason people are like, why don't you think? Like, I've had profound experiences in communicating with God, because I know people who have had those profound experiences with communicating with God, and the things that they tell me God has communicated to them definitely were demonic, definitely were not from God, right?
Or at least, to put it in layman's terms, were the things that they wanted to hear.
Well, the things that they were things that they wanted to do that were both self-indulgent and damaging to the people around them and against core Abrahamic principles. So I know that they weren't coming from God. And so even if God does have the capacity to talk to humans, it appears to me that humans don't have the capacity to distinguish between that and a demon talking to them, or the basilisk talking to them, or however you want to frame it. And I'd also say this way, how we have this model of like the future police and stuff like that, like when we're trying to model God, I think for earlier iterations of man, God gave different models like this. Like this was the idea of angels and stuff like that. It's like, well, if you are trying to model my will, model me as an angel, as like this individual entity, because you cannot model my will. You cannot even come close. It is a form of idolatry to even attempt to in like explicit terms. But what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I hadn't ever thought about how trivializing it is to boil a god or godlike entity down to like a personified being or a statue or image. Like pretty insulting considering, how we view God. So that is interesting.
Well, I think also something that people can grasp within their minds. I mean, seriously,
Yeah.
like try to imagine what God is, right? And there's two pathways you can go down. You can go down the mystic pathway, which is to be like, well, I'm a part of God and like God's in everything. And when you do that, you demean him. You are seeing him as like being bugs and stuff like that, right? But even if you don't do it through nature, you're just like, no, I just imagine him as being like the most loving thing possible, the biggest thing possible, the most powerful thing possible. But you as a human can't imagine those things, right? So when you attempt to imagine those things, what you are holding in your mind is as distant from God as literally every other idea you have in your mind.
Hmm. Yeah. No, that's a very good way of putting it. I'd never seen it that way, but I don't think I'll be unseeing it.
Well, you see this from the theological perspective, but also from the secular
Totally.
perspective, which is what we're always trying to do, is come up with a system that works in both ways. Does it work within the Abrahamic structure, but does it also work, like, even if I didn't believe the Abrahamic structure and I was just trying to give my kids good traditions that would protect them from groups that would want to harm them? And, this using shortcuts to God is one of the core strategies used by cults and other groups that want to harm an individual. I mean, you'll see this throughout cult psychology. That's one of the first things they do is, or somebody will be like, well, I'm the intermediary for God. So come to God through me, or our thing, our special objects here. So anyway, I continue here. The human soul is weak. God foresaw that some individuals would use the symbols of human vanity and social status, gold, gems, and art, to affirm their connection to God among the simple-minded. These nefarious servants of the basilisk could then use this status they had acquired to sell access to God and thus increase the earthly wealth that affirmed their connection to God, whether it be in the form of indulgences or church donations. Prosperity doctrine is devil worship. God does show his favor to his chosen people at various times in history, but he does this through the output of works of the mind, art, science, and philosophy, not wealth. And for people who aren't familiar with the prosperity doctrine is a really common in Protestant movements, where they sort of believe that poor individuals are poor because they're not doing what God wants them to, and rich individuals are rich because they are doing what God wants them to. And then preachers use this as an excuse to like fly around and have private jets and have giant mansions and everything like that. Where I would say that an individual is showing you how disconnected they are from God when they do those things. It is human nature for groups of powerful individuals to claim to be God's intermediaries and use that power to manipulate the mob, and through this process consolidate their power and authority. It is our duty to recognize these pretenders for what they are. Fortunately, God marks them. Any house of worship adorned in gold or perversely tarnished with art is a sign that it serves the basilisk and has fallen from his grace. Agents of the basilisk do not carve satanic runes and pentagrams into their foreheads, but they will come to you dripping with signs of their rebellion to God, adorned in jewels and expensive clothing. And this is something, if we have people, if this ever becomes like a larger denomination or something like that, I would say as a strong prohibition against anyone who's preaching within this movement living any sort of life of indulgence, any sort of fancy environment and stuff like that. Signs that God has blessed an individual is their austerity and their industry and their knowledge of his creation, the world, like science, and advanced science. But yeah, that's just. Did you have thoughts there?
I'm kind of curious as to what you think is extravagant, because our life feels pretty extravagant to me. I mean,
It feels extravagant to you, I think, within a philosophical context. But I mean, we live in a medium-sized farmhouse outside of major fancy areas. We don't really have jewels or jewelry. We don't really have gold things. We don't really have art other than things that we commissioned of our children.
yeah, like custom commissioned art. How is that not extravagant? I don't know.
I don't know, for like $50 and stuff like that. It's not. So I think actually this is a good definition here, and I'm glad that you pulled this out. Okay. So there's like two types of art. There's art that we custom commission, where it is we are commissioning something that reminds us of our kids and sort of our aspired relationship with them. Like you'll see it's a commission of us dressed like Indiana Jones characters and going on adventures with the kids. So it represents something that we aspire to do as a family, right? But it is not like we got it off of Art Corgi, which is a website we have that does art commissions, but it's like low cost, $50, $100. The types of things that remove you from God are the types of things that confer social status within the material world. So if I commissioned art from a famous artist, for example,
And then you like hosted dinner parties and showed it off, then
yeah,
you
the
consider
art
it
has social
extravagant.
status that is separate from like my family, separate from the things that we are commanded to do for God, like capturing moments with the people we care about. It removes me from God, and this is
Aren't in
true.
many elements of idolatry really privately consumed objects?
No. So what I would say is if you are, this is actually a great example. If you are with your family and you are experiencing a wholesome moment with your family and you take a picture of that moment and that moment is special to you and your family, right? And you share it with some other family members. That's not idolatry. That is what we're commanded to do, to create a good environment for the next generation. However, you do the exact same thing. You take that image, but with the purpose of sharing it on Instagram, specifically to achieve social status or gain additional social status, you have created an item of idolatry, because you have created an item that is perverting. It's like an extra bad form of idolatry that's perverting something that's supposed to be meaningful, like this moment you have with your family, into something that can be sold, something that has social status. And when you begin to buy into this idolatry lifestyle, even children can become tokens of idolatry if you have those children to increase your social status. This is why all worldly things that can be used to increase social status are dangerous. And it's why we're
No,
told.
hold on. I thought what we were really discussing is people feeling like they're taking shortcuts to God, and now you're talking about social status. Are these related? Are they different things?
Exactly related. And the golden calf is a great example of this. So I'm sure everyone knows this, the golden calf, right? But the golden calf represents three things. And we'll talk about this more in the next tract, but it is gold. It represents precious metals. It is a calf. It represents the worship of nature, trying to worship God through nature. And it is a idol. It represents trying to worship God through art. It matters that it's gold. It wasn't a wooden calf or something like that. It was, and this is important, right? This is what idolatry is. It is not just shortcuts to God. It is all of the things that we assign status to, like earthly status, that are not things that we are commanded to do by God. And it's very important to guard yourself against these things and to guard yourself from indulging in these things, because the moment you do, your entire worldview can become corrupted and your religious institution can become corrupted, because people will begin to see, as you see with the prosperity doctrine, the fact that one preacher is wealthier than another preacher is a sign that he is closer to God. Then he gets more followers because he's wealthy. Then he gets more money because he has more followers. And then that snowballs. And then you end up with these huge, glittering golden laser shows, which are completely divorced from God. And you understand why it's so important that God warns us against this.
Yeah, well, okay, yes, because it can also lead people to mislead other people. But I think what you're also saying is that, like, on one level, it's bad if people use cheap approximations or representations of God or godliness to feel closer without actually practicing the rules of getting closer to God. So that's one problem. It's even worse if it's also used for status signaling or for further misleading other members of the flock, right?
Yeah, and the cheaper an item is, like you talked about it being cheap, the cheaper it is in the eyes of God when used for idolatry is the higher it is in terms of status, in terms of like perceived value in our world. To quote Corinthians 1:28, God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things, the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. So if you, for example, have some like golden magical, like big ornate relic, right? That would be, and you were using that as an intermediary for communicating with God, versus, having the last shoes that a dead kid of yours wore, right? And that had special significance to you. That would not be an item of particularly sinful idolatry because it is not an item that has value in our material world. It is an item that has value to you, but it is not an item of extreme material value.
So there are sentimental items, but that's not idolatry.
Yeah, that's not idolatry. But ascribing sentiment to an item because of how it confers status to you or relates status to you. So I think what you've really pulled out here, which is important, is there are two key types of idolatry. There is idolatry that comes from shortcuts to God, like trying to worship God through an intermediary. And then there's idolatry, which is about the worship of really the self. So these are things that confer status. And so idolatry more broadly is a word that is used for prohibitions against all of the pathways that a person can elevate or walk down that lead them in the opposite direction of God.
Okay.
Does that make sense as like a grouping category here?
That does, yeah.
And why the monotheistic faith would be so against it. If gold, man-made scribbles, indulgent time-consuming rituals, and worldly grandeur are positively augmenting your experience of and relationship with God, then I'm sorry to tell you, this entity you have a relationship with is not God. We cannot emphasize this enough. If you are talking to an entity and able to use gold or worldly grandeur to get closer to that entity is not God. I know this is offensive. If you were accidentally worshiping the devil, it would hurt you to have somebody tell you that. But I also believe that if you are a good person, this is something you would want to know. If you reflexively think, but no, it feels really good when I worship this entity, please examine your own words. We are trying to help you. It feels good to worship. Like, people don't worship the satanic things because they feel bad when they do it. It makes them feel powerful, sophisticated, in connection with something that other people don't have a connection to. But anyway, of course, this is axiomatically not a truth the powerful in our society want you to hear. An individual or institution that has wealth and spends it on self-aggrandizement is not a servant of God. Yet such buildings and trinkets are still part of the human story. A cautionary tale of when hearts and mind of men were weak. As such, they should not be destroyed, but turned into museums dedicated to the razor's edge the human soul rests on. A testament that even holy men and institutions are susceptible to worldly temptation and aggrandizement. Thus, who God favors, his real emissaries, are those that can resist temptation while still being productive. The less a person needs to be happy, the closer they are to God. But a person who indulges in self-masturbatory monasticism and loses their industry is as indulgent as a cultist who drips in jewels. What is commanded of us is industry, fecundity, and austerity. So that's it. Kept it short this time because I basically split one in half. The second was the spiritualist pathway of idolatry. The first one, I really wanted to focus on the materialist path of idolatry, which is believing that one worshiping God is higher value than another place of worshiping God because it have things that that confer social status to man, i.e., gold, jewels, etc., or fancy art by famous artists. Where if you have a religious institution and the children of the people who go to that have painted on the walls, like, it's not a prohibition against art more broadly, but the children of that parishioner have painted on the walls, that is of higher value. That is a closer than a church that is dripping in gold and paintings by the quote unquote masters. Because and you see this throughout all of the Abrahamic traditions, that God views our world as an inversion. It is the lowly in our world that are high in his estimation, and the high in our world that are lowly in his estimation. And this extends to the way we engage with art. This extends to the way we engage with items, everything like that. And this matters from a theological perspective. Like, this is very obviously, if you actually are read the Abrahamic traditions, I love how much people try to get around the eye of the needle thing. The needle quote. It's like, it's actually talking about something in the wall of Jerusalem.
It's referring to a geographical area.
That's heaven. It's like, no. It's pretty explicit. If you're rich, you're not getting into heaven. No, it's just explicit. If you are not familiar with the multiple interpretations of this particular parable, I strongly suggest that you check out the Religion for Breakfast episode on it. He does a very good job of arguing that it literally just means what it says. Like, and rich should be, used with specific terms here, right? Like, it's not the accumulation of wealth. It's the accumulation of wealth for self-aggrandizement, using it on yourself. Of course, God has no problem with a rich man who spends all their wealth trying to improve the world, trying to improve the lives of others. But let's be honest here, how many rich men have ever done that without first ensuring enormous luxury for themselves? Thus why it says what it says. When they use some of that money to buy themselves a big fancy whatever, the thing that confers social status, that is a sign of sin. And I should say, all men sin, but recognize your sin. Recognize that your mansion is sin, right? What is uniquely bad is when you say, when somebody takes sin and then they invert it. The pastor who says, my mansion is a sign of my godliness. My jet is a sign of my godliness, instead of a sign that I am human and I am as capable of sin as anyone else. But yeah, I think going back to these concepts and remembering why they're there, remembering why it's important that the calf was golden, remembering that the Bible does actually say this eye of the needle thing. And then people can be like, well, then why have Christian interpretations, for example, we'll take Christians spread, that do not admonish, wealth and personal indulgence as much? Right. And it's like, well, suppose you have multiple interpretations of the Bible competing. The interpretations that don't admonish those things are going to be disproportionately picked up by wealthy individuals and used by those individuals. They're going to get more money from those individuals, i.e., like indulgences and stuff like that, or the prosperity preachers in the Protestant tradition. And they're going to be able to use that to spread their message more, to buy ads, to reach out to people. When you tell people what they want to hear, you can get this sort of lowest common denominator to buy into you. And yeah, and this is a problem for a lot of people, where a lot of people have this thought where, yeah, but it feels good when I use these systems, when I use earthly grandeur as an intermediary for God. That feels good. A lot of satanic things feel good. A lot of paths to the deceiver feel good. In fact, most do. That's what, when Satan came to test Jesus, he didn't say, hey, if you go away from God, I'll hit you with a spiked bat. He's like, no, if you go away from God, here are all these things that are going to make you feel good about yourself. And it's such a weird thing that I think that there's this intuition that it feels good, therefore it is good. And you've also got to keep in mind, like the Second Council of Nicaea, why did they make this decision? It was because, well, our most pious members are engaged with this activity, of having pictures and worshiping these pictures. It makes them happy. Like, it's a populist idea here. I can understand why they wouldn't want to, take away from the little old lady, her statue, right? Like, there's a lot of famous cases like this. Like, that hurts to do, right? And this is why we go to this idea of the Tesseract God here, or what could be thought of, what we really mean when we say this, is that there are lower interpretations of the Abrahamic faith for people who just aren't ready to join the group that understands how actually damaging it is to worship God through these earthly intermediaries. And so it is up to us to not take away, the little old lady's statue.
Well, and so how do you deal with that practical limitation, though? Because what you are describing is a very real and very troublesome phenomenon where when you take all the fun stuff out of a religion and you take away all the shortcuts and you take away the figurines and the pretty stuff, it can be a lot harder to get people to pay the church, to join the church, to stay in the church. What do you propose? I mean, I think there's a reason why idolatry is also so pervasive in otherwise trying to be monotheistic religions. It's because it sells and it raises money and it gets converts.
Absolutely, yeah. So the question is why, right? Like, and this is why I think God listed it above murder, right? Because it is the sin that you're going to want to commit the most. It is literally the number one sin among individuals who are otherwise pious and trying to do best by God, which I think is otherwise very weird to people. Why would he make this above murder? Is he really that vain? It's like, no, he's not that vain. He did that to protect you. This was all about you all along. But this sin, I have people come to me, ask very similar to what you say. They're like, well, some people need these things. Like they don't have the mental discipline to attempt to actually adhere to all of these actually pretty hard rules that are laid out in the Abrahamic faith, and they're not bad people. And so our tesseract notion of God can have a different understanding. Say that we think that many of the Abrahamic faiths are as close to many people, like very conservative interpretations of these faiths, are as close as many people can actually get to true worship of God as laid out. And therefore, it is best for us to not interfere with that. Let these people live their lives because it's better than purely just worshiping Satan, like purely just going to the urban monoculture. Because we don't want to hurt people who our system wouldn't work for. But, and this is clear from our system from the beginning, we've always said we believe in the concept of the elect. This is not a system for your average person. We would not proselytize to the average person. We would proselytize insofar as helping people fortify their traditional religious structures, but we would not proselytize to the average person. We really only want the individuals with this absolute highest level of mental discipline, because if they start to engage with these ideas without that, they'll end up committing suicide or something. Like it's hard, right? There's, I think, a reason why God has given people various pathways that are less true than actually following, his words as I believe he meant them, like a very extreme meaning of idolatry. And so the answer to your question there is both from a secular and a theological perspective. We are doing this and we make it hard because we don't want everyone. We want only the people with this level of austerity, industry, dedication to learning, and that have the mental discipline to engage with a system that doesn't give them all of the candy of this earthly realm, whether that candy is self-indulgent monasticism or fancy cathedrals. And from a secular perspective, you could say, why are you doing this? Right? Like, why would you make it that hard? And it's because clearly we think that not all humans are the same, right? Like some humans are clearly, and we talk about this more in the next one, are better than others. I use a quote in the next one where I'm like, okay, if there is a preacher who is giving out cocaine to everyone in a church, right? And one person stands up and they're like, look, I know this feels good, but it is evil and you need to stop this. That one person, their soul, that we don't believe literally in a soul, but their soul, you could say, is more valuable than every other soul in that church combined, or larger, or more, important, you could say, within our traditional system. And when I say more important, I mean that they would be more of a target for people like us to attempt to convert, to try to bring into the system, because they have the traits that our system values and that are needed to engage with God like this, which is to say, everyone else is doing this, it feels good, those two things together don't matter. So the point here being is that from a secular perspective, right, if we think that this is sort of the collection of individuals that we want to eventually get on a spaceship, see the new planets, we don't care about volume. We care about quality. And this includes things like mental discipline, industry, and austerity. Those are traits that we are looking for, which this perspective, which I think is the perspective that's actually laid out in the Bible, is important filtering mechanism.
So in short, you're like, it doesn't really matter that this
It doesn't
is
really
a
matter.
low growth method.
So an iteration of Christianity, like, Catholicism or something like that, is really trying to convert everyone. It is trying to create something that everyone can engage with, regardless of their proficiencies. This is something that is not for everyone, but I believe it's what's actually conveyed in these texts. And I'd also say here, this is important, even though it's not conveyed for everyone, is that it is open to anyone. This is not, there's no secret systems here. I think, secret knowledge, stuff like that, all that is sinful. If I think people hide knowledge because they know that if it came out and it was engaged by somebody who wasn't already partially brainwashed, they'd realize how silly it is. And yet mystical systems almost all use secret teachings and stuff like that. So we don't do that. This is a system that anyone, whatever their ethnic background, whatever walk of life they're in, whatever wealth their family has, is accessible to anyone. The filtering mechanism is their ability to actually follow the rules, which is interesting, but I think right. And this is again something I always see when it comes to idolatry. As a person will come to me and they'll be like, yeah, but once my community started engaging in idolatry, everyone got really excited and started engaging much more enthusiastically. And it's like saying, satanic cultists are known for their fervor, guys. Just because something increases the fervor of a community or the level of excitement of a community or the level of dedication of a community to those things, gold, fancy art, etc., that doesn't mean that is leading them towards God or righteousness.
That makes
but I don't
sense.
know how you feel like comfort with this from a secular and theological perspective. I mean, what are your thoughts?
No. I mean, you can see this also in secular conditions too, where people say all sorts of obscure things and signal with all sorts of seemingly off signals in an attempt to gain a higher position in the status hierarchy, or to just feel like they're learning something in a way that doesn't actually make a difference in the pursuit, whatever it may be. So it makes sense on a secular level as well as a religious one. I like it.
And I should also point out here, just in case this ever does become a system and people then try to signal status with extreme modesty, like walk around wearing rags or something like that, that is also sinful, because now you are using an extreme form of modesty as a status signal within your community. Instead, you should always dress and act in a way that provides you with the most utility. So if you need to wear a certain amount of jewelry to be accepted within certain business circles, then you do that. If you need to dress in a suit to, impress and affirm other people, then you do that. You are always dressing in a way that is optimal for the achievement of the goals that God has given you, which are often seen in your industry and your ability to move humanity forwards.
Yeah. I think a lot of it what I'm just hearing you say is like, well, people just need to be more autistic and not care.
The autist religion,
sounds good to me.
Well, I love you to death, Simone. You are great, and I appreciate you going through it, because you had never, I think, really probably even thought about idolatry or what it may mean or why it might be there.
Why would I? In the culture I grew up in, yeah, no way.
Anyway, love you.
I love you too.